We're going to start this discussion with the federal government. Our federal government is the national government of the country. That means its laws and regulations apply nationwide. We are known as a federal republic. This means we have elected representatives, our Congress, and our elected leader, our president, who lives there at our White House. All of the authority of the federal government comes from the U.S. Constitution. This is known as the supreme law of the land. The Constitution establishes the structure of our federal government, which we'll talk about in a minute, and it also lays out explicitly what the federal government can do. These are called the enumerated powers. So let's talk about the structure of government. This is a little small, a little hard to see, but we're going to dive into each of these branches in a second. But it's important to know that our Constitution lays out three separate branches of the federal government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, in that order. We're not sure if they meant it, but a lot of legal scholars give credence to the fact that the drafters of the constitutions, the forefathers of our country, put the legislative branch first, followed by the executive, followed by the judicial. Some ascribe a certain level of importance to that order. But first, let's talk about the legislative first, since that's what they did in our Constitution. So the legislative branch, known collectively as Congress, is composed of the Senate and of the House of Representatives. Those are our two branches of Congress. In the Senate, we have 100 elected officials, 100 senators. Each state gets 2 senators. Regardless of size, regardless of population, every state gets 2 senators, and they serve 6-year terms. Things are very different in our House of Representatives. We have 435 representatives, and the number per state is based on population. So as population shifts between the states, so does representation in the House. Representatives are there on 2-year terms, so it's much, much shorter. It's probably important to note that we don't have any kind of term limit. You can be in the Senate or in the House or in Congress, between the two, as long as you want. But you'll notice the difference in the two branches. The Senate is smaller. They serve longer. The Senate has a lot more continuity and stability, whereas the House is very fluid. It changes quite a bit. And because there are more members, you tend to see a little more differences of positions. So in the Senate, with 2 per state, a giant state like Texas, senators kind of have to appeal to everybody. Whereas if you are a representative in a small county, you really only need to think about the people in your county who are voting for you. And so you tend to see more stability, less partisanship in the Senate, but it's the opposite in the House. Definitely 2 very different sides of Congress. And they are directly elected. So there's no middle person in between the citizens in their state and the elected officials themselves. They are directly elected by the people. This is Article 1 of the Constitution that lays out the legislative branch, and they also lay out their powers. I'll talk about a few here. There are more than this, but here are the ones that are particularly relevant to what we're talking about. So Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to tax and spend. So Congress decides who to tax and how much to tax, and only Congress gets to decide what we spend our money on. Congress also has the right to borrow money when the national government runs out. Congress has the ability to regulate trade. So trade, commerce between our country and other countries, and also in between the states. They have the power to declare war. And again, they specifically have the power to regulate commerce in between the states. So movement, but only in between the states. Now you can imagine how this plays out. If the movement is just inside the state, Congress does not have the authority to act there. But when it's between the states, that's where Congress can step in. And then there's this sort of catch-all, what we call the necessary and proper clause. Article 1 of the Constitution states that Congress can pass any laws necessary and proper to accomplish their foregoing powers. So that gives them a little more leeway. Let's talk about the executive branch. This is our president and vice president and cabinet members below. So unlike Congress, the members of which are directly elected by people, the president is actually elected by an electoral college. This is a very complex, antiquated system where each state gets a certain number of votes based on its population. Now, states can choose how to apportion its votes based off the popular vote of citizens. They can decide winner take all or proportionally. So say we are the state of Texas. I'm not exactly sure how they do apportion their votes, but say 70% of its citizens, of its voters, vote for candidate A and 30% vote for candidate B. Texas can give all of its votes to the winner of that popular election, or it can choose to give 70% of its votes to the winner and 30% of its votes to the other candidate. It's completely up to the states. So if you have ever read in the news about how a president can lose the popular vote but still win the election, it's because of the way these numbers are played with. The executive branch is described and given its powers in Article 2 of our Constitution. These are some of the powers enumerated to the president. The president has the authority to execute laws passed by Congress. So Congress can pass a law, for example, stating that every resident of the United States should get $5. Maybe that's the law they pass. It's up to the president to figure out how to do that, to execute that law, to cut the checks, to have them delivered, to set up the agency that receives phone calls when people don't know where their money went, things like that. So Congress passes the law. The president decides how it is executed. And there's actually a lot of power within that execution power. To determine how something is executed is very subjective. And some presidents actually believe that the power to execute also means the power not to execute. So Congress may pass the law, but the president doesn't do anything to execute it. An example of this would be our federal laws on marijuana. So marijuana, even though it is legal in many states, it is still federally illegal. So we're going to talk about conflicts in state and federal. But the federal executive for the last several years has chosen not to execute that law, not to really go after that type of criminal behavior. It's just not a priority. So the executive can choose not to execute a law. It's quite powerful. The president is also the commander-in-chief of the military. So if you remember, Congress has the right to declare war, but the president gets to control the military in executing that war. The president has the ability to make treaties, although the Senate is required to approve any treaty that the president makes. So this can come up in the context of treaties on environmental issues, on climate change that can affect our industry. Finally, the president has the sole authority to appoint Supreme Court justices. So we'll talk a little bit more about our Supreme Court justices, but those justices are part of the third branch, the judicial branch of government. And finally, the president gets to appoint ambassadors to other countries. The judicial branch, the third branch, Article 3. So the judicial branch at the top is composed of a 9-member Supreme Court and 2 lower levels of court. That is a picture of our current Supreme Court. It's 9 members, but interestingly enough, the Constitution does not say anything about the number of members in the Supreme Court. So if you have heard in the news talk of expanding the Supreme Court, that is completely up to the president, who has the power to appoint Supreme Court judges. I just mentioned this, so not only are Supreme Court judges chosen by the president, federal judges at these lower levels are also chosen by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So all of these federal judges, including the Supreme Court judge, they're chosen by the president, but the Senate has to agree and confirm. And these federal judges at all 3 levels are appointed for life. They never, their term never ends. They're never forced to retire. They are appointed for life. The reason for this is to make sure they don't feel pressured by their decisions. They should feel inoculated from public pressure. So they don't need to find a job after this. They're not going to get fired because of any particular decision. They are appointed for life, and so that supposedly is supposed to help them only worry about the issue at hand and not any personal consequences to themselves. So I mentioned there are 3 levels. We'll talk a little bit more about those levels when we talk about dispute resolution. Article 3, I mentioned, talks about the judiciary and the judicial branch. So if you hear the term Article 3 judge, this is what they're talking about. And so here are the powers of the judicial branch. They have the power to interpret the meaning of laws passed by Congress. So Congress passes the law, the president executes the law, the justices interpret the law. So if Congress passes a law saying on Wednesdays we wear pink, but we're not sure exactly what shades of pink count, and I wear this shirt, I could go before the justices and they would interpret the law to say that is pink or that is not pink. So sometimes the words, the meaning's not exactly clear. It's really hard to write laws, as we'll talk about. And so when there is ambiguity, when we're really not sure what was meant, it's up to the judicial branch to tell us what it means. And their law is binding. They also apply the laws to disputes. So sometimes we completely understand exactly what the law says, but we're not really sure how it shakes out when it comes to the facts presented. So that's up to the judges. They apply the laws to those disputes. And finally, a very important power of the judicial branch is they can invalidate laws that they find violate the Constitution. So the Constitution says a lot of things. It says what Congress can and cannot do. It says what the president can and cannot do. It, as we'll talk in a minute, provides for certain rights for all citizens that cannot be violated. Any law or regulation that violate any of those tenets of the Constitution can be struck down if the judiciary finds that it is in violation. Because remember, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It trumps everything else. And that's a really important aspect of our federal government. So again, just to recap, at the federal level, our national level, we have these 3 branches of government: legislative, Congress, which is made of the House of Representatives and the Senate; our executive branch, which executes the laws, made up of our president, their vice president, and any administrators they want to help out; and then the judicial branch, which is our justices, led at the top by our Supreme Court, and then other levels of judges with varying powers. So, again, Articles 1, 2, and 3, our first 3 articles of the Constitution, state what the federal government can do. But the Bill of Rights, which are at the end, these were amendments to the original Constitution, states what the federal government absolutely cannot do. So if they take one of their enumerated powers, say the power to spend, and they decide they want to pass a budget and spend some money, if they do so in a way that violates any of the rights of the Bill of Rights, it's not allowed. Just because the Constitution says you can do A It doesn't mean you can do A if it violates one of these rights. So let's talk about these rights. I don't have all of them here. There are several, but I have a few that are either relevant to us or just very prominent, and perhaps you've heard of them. So for one, we have freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Those are both in the First Amendment. We have the right to bear arms, which is the Second Amendment. Now, this is a situation where, again, it's not exactly clear what was meant when it was written. So the justices, the Supreme Court, are often trying to elucidate exactly what does the right to bear arms mean. That's a very short sentence for a very complex topic, and so it's up to the justices to figure that out. It includes the Fourth Amendment, which is the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Not all searches and seizures, unreasonable ones. And so this will be very relevant to some of the topics we talk about when the government wants access to the data in automated vehicles. And the last one here is called the right to due process, which is found in the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is a little bit of a grab bag of lots of different things, but basically due process means the legal process that is due to you as a citizen. So if you are going through a jury trial, it can't be a sham trial. They really have to do all of the parts of the process. You have the right to that process, the right to be heard. That's the due process right. That's going to come up in some of these regulations that sometimes get overturned when Congress or state government tries to pass a regulation over some of this technology. A citizen or a company can argue there was no due process. You passed this law without going through the full pathway of legislation. So that one's relevant to us as well. And finally, a very important right of the Bill of Rights, the 10th one. This is the final amendment of the Constitution in that Bill of Rights. And this states that any powers not specifically given to the federal government, so remember that list of powers, that enumerated powers, if it's not on that list, it belongs to the state governments. So what the Constitution is doing is creating a little bit of a list for the federal government and saying everything else is the province of the state government. This is where some of the fights happen. And this is why we have some federal laws and some state laws. Okay, so let's just go back over all the things we talked about, make sure you have a good understanding of the really important aspects. About the federal government, the Constitution is the basis for all government authority in the United States. It lays out, the three branches. It organizes our federal government: legislative, which is Congress. They pass the laws. Executive, our president, who executes the laws. And judicial, our courts, which interpret and apply those laws. But all of that is organized by the Constitution. It also says exactly which powers reside in the federal government, also known as our enumerated powers, and says anything else, anything we didn't specifically mention, that's the state's power to regulate, not the federal government's. It's a really important amendment. It will come up quite a bit in the rest of our talk. And then finally, the Constitution ends with a series of amendments. And so the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. Those are specific rights for citizens and residents of the United States that neither the federal government nor the state government may ever violate. So even if they have the power to regulate in a specific area given to them by the Constitution, they cannot regulate in a way that would violate anything that's protected by those bills of rights. So these are the most important aspects of the federal government. We'll talk about state and local government.